Hi, everyone. Today I'm speaking with Daniel Lehnberg from Grin, or working with Grin. It's a really interesting privacy-oriented crypto asset. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Henrik. Hi, everybody.
Thank you for talking to us today. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved in Grin.
Sure. So I have a background in gaming, online gaming. I used to work for a big gaming firm in various forms for about 12 to 13 years, doing business development, marketing, product management, and new product development, new concepts at the end of that stint. I got involved in Grin as I was researching the field for that company. We're looking at different use cases involving gaming, uh, primarily with around Bitcoin, but uh, we were kind of coming into these limitations. We were seeing like regulators, regulated firms, gaming firms, and so on, in order to accept Bitcoin. There was some very stringent limitations on how you could do it because of fungibility and kind of fungibility concerns. The expectation was that users were supposed to deposit and withdraw coins back into their own to the same addresses, and you were supposed to do not only KYC checks on the users, but also do KYC checks on the coins themselves. And
Right.
this kind of struck me as being wow, this, in order for businesses to uh, comply with these requirements, it's going to be very, very difficult. It's going to be very onerous to do it, and it's going to have a lot of friction. And it kind of made me realize that, for businesses and end users and entities, in order to transact in a way, you need good fungibility.
Right, and I
And
guess that's a property of good money, right? It has to be fungible.
yeah, yeah, and becomes quite obvious. I think, and we have a lot of things probably coming on the horizon now, with regards to kind of regulators looking at crypto more intently, and I think we're going to see that Bitcoin, for all the benefits it has, it really doesn't. It suffers a lot from that lack of fungibility, uh, and and um, and so I was actually at an Ethereum conference at the time. I discovered Grin, and there were a lot of projects there, having like proposing to solve some problems with really complex solutions, and there were a lot of kind of unanswered questions on there at the time, and I kind of really didn't see how it all could work. And then somebody gave me a tip to look into Grin and Mimblewimble, the protocol that Grin is implementing, and I was just kind of blown away by how what approach it was taking. Not only was the protocol kind of elegant and simple, but there was also this community of developers that were looking to implement it in a very minimal way. And it's a community project. It's open source. It's not a for-profit organization anywhere. There's no legal entity. There's no company. There's no CEO. There's no investors. There's no ICO. There wasn't anything. And this, mind you, this was in 2018. I think I heard about it first, and it was kind of still peak ICO bubble. It hadn't really burst properly yet, and these developers had been at it for a year and a half or so, a year maybe. And in the midst of everything, in the midst of all the chaos that was going in 2017, they had opted not to do anything like that. No developer tax, no pre-mine, nothing. And it just kind of blew me away, because it made me really interested in the project, because essentially what these developers were saying is that they're doing it for the tech and for the benefit it could have, and it's more of a, you're not doing it to get rich quick, and so that kind of attracted my attention. And then it just kind of went from there. I started getting, fell down the rabbit hole and started getting more and more engaged in the project, and in the community, and I've been going since.
And what's your
Now
role in Green today?
sure. So at this point, I'm doing product management, a bit of admin stuff. I help with governance things, meeting notes, planning, some outreach to wider community and the crypto space itself. I run a newsletter. It's kind of I'm not a developer, at least not trained as a developer, but I'm kind of trying to help in technical aspects as much as I can. I'm being funded by the project on a part-time basis for
Fantastic.
some work.
That's really interesting. You don't have a foundation or anything, but you still managed to get some funding from the project.
Yeah, so maybe clarify that as well. That we're run completely we're funded solely by donations, and so we've managed to get. We've been very lucky and fortunate to have strong supporters and backers in the ecosystem. Uh, Probably because there's no get rich quick scheme, and it's kind of purely doing this for as a kind of like a public good effort. And so we have some donations that we have in a general fund that is kept in a multi-sig wallet by members of the community, and I'm able to be funded part-time for that.
But that's really fantastic. And I think some of the things you mentioned makes Grin very unique. It had a very unique origin story as well. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how Grin got started, or Mimblewimble and Grin, how it all
Sure.
started.
So in October 2016, I think, or in the summer 2016, maybe even, an anonymous individual joined an IRC channel for Bitcoin developers and dropped a Tor onion link to a text file that was outlining a Mimblewimble protocol. This person pseudonymously called themselves Tom Elvis Jedusor, which is the French name for Lord Voldemort of the Harry Potter series. And Mimblewimble is a curse, a tongue-tying curse from the Harry Potter series. The protocol was essentially combining some previous research that had been done in the space, mainly from Gregory Maxwell, confidential transactions, and one-way aggregated the signatures and coin joins. And you kind of put them all together in an elegant protocol that could work as a blockchain. This was later picked up by Andrew Polstra, and he kind of reworked the paper a bit. There was some errors in it, or some mistakes that he corrected, and he published it again. And a few months after that, an anonymous individual or group of individuals called Ignatius Peverell, which is also a character from the Harry Potter series, picked the project up and announced Grin, coming from Gringotts Bank of Wizardry or something, Goblin Bank. I haven't read the Harry Potter series myself, so I'm not too familiar with them. But there's a lot of Harry Potter lore in the creation story of Grin. Ignatius announced the project. It's written in Rust, which they chose, and then they started working on it, and gradually over time a community was built around it that has now become what it is today. We have Ignatius has since left the project, and we have a couple of anonymous developers. We have a couple of non-anonymous developers. There's one developer working full-time that is paid from the project, Yeast Plume or Michael Cordner, who's been integral to the launch of the project. And then we have others in kind of the frequent contributors.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And as I said, I think that makes Grin very unique and somewhat similar to Bitcoin as well, I think, in that you have anonymous founders. You have some Bitcoin core developers, as you mentioned as well, that has been involved in the project in some sense.
So yeah, there was some interest from Bitcoin, from Andrew Polstra specifically, in the early days of like Mimblewimble as a protocol. As far as I know, Andrew hasn't been very active in Grin itself, but I think in general, Bitcoin community was very interested in the protocol and the ideas that it brought. Some of these ideas and some of the functionality of Grin, for example, the use of Schnorr signatures, is also something that Bitcoin is considering adding. Uh, there's it's I think I would say that Bitcoin core developers are probably interested in good research and good ideas, but they're not maybe necessarily interested in Grin.
Right, right.
They're probably very focused on Bitcoin.
Sure, sure. Uh, but in terms of having no pre-mine, anything like that, everyone start at ground zero, so to speak. In that way, is quite similar.
Oh, absolutely, and I don't think they sometimes there's like this animosity between. I wouldn't say Bitcoin Core, but maybe Bitcoin, what is called maximalists or so on, and other projects. Uh, I haven't really experienced much of that between Grin and Bitcoin, probably because there's no get-rich-quick scheme here. Sometimes we hear from areas that, you should be focused on Bitcoin. Maybe you should be spending all your time on Bitcoin rather than spending it on some other coin, which I think is fair. It's a fair argument. Bitcoin has very strong network effects, and it could benefit from improvements as well. But there's a group of people here who are interested in working on Grin, and I think that's okay as well. And we can learn from the different projects, can learn from each other, and we're a bit of we're able, because we're so young and fairly experimental compared to something like Bitcoin, who has to be very, very conservative in its approach. We have more freedom to experiment with new ideas that if they pan out and they work well, other projects can learn from.
Yeah, that's true. So Mimblewimble is the underlying technology, if you like to call it that, and Grin is one implementation of that technology.
Correct.
And there is another implementation as well called Beam. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
And can you mention how that is different from Grin?
So Grin was the first kind of implementation of Mimblewimble, and as part of that, it solved some challenges and problems of how to. There was like a Mimblewimble mailing list, and there was an evolution of the protocol, the blockchain protocol, together with Grin. And in 2018, another implementation was launched or announced, Beam, which is an implementation completely from scratch, written with new code, that implements a similar protocol and Mimblewimble in C++. And the project is supported by a company. It's a development company, and they have this similar to Zcash, the founder reward structure for the first, I think it's 5 years. I'm not sure. Part of the mining rewards goes to fund the company and a foundation that ultimately is gonna. I think the idea is that over time they're going to become more decentralized, but for the early days, they're a centralized entity that's doing all the development.
So the principles are different. The inflation rate, I think, is different as well, and it's a different funding model.
Of course, yes. Yeah. They have capped emission, whereas Grin on the other side has 1 Grin emission per second forever. So it's a linear emission, and Grin does 1 minute block times. So there's 60 Grins per minute forever. And that means that, the first years, there's a lot of emission, and over time, it just kind of asymptotically decreases to 0.
So getting back to how it got started, the white papers were released a few years ago. The community started building around Grin in 1718, and then it finally launched, I think, almost exactly 1 year ago from
Correct.
today.
1 year and 1 day.
Yeah, 1 year and 1 day, January 15th, 2019. And that was almost exactly 10 years after Bitcoin launched in 2009. Right. What is Grin trying to do different than Bitcoin? What's the kind of the overall goal, if you like, or is it trying to improve something or do something different versus Bitcoin?
Yes, I think on a philosophical level, Bitcoin seems to have moved more towards this store of value use case, right? A bit more like digital gold use case, where Whereas what we're thinking about with Grin, I think, is more this use case of having electronic cash. And as part of that, on a more technical level, the Wimble protocol and Grin's approach to it enables us to do we get quite nice trade-offs between scalability, privacy, decentralization, and fairness. And these are kind of like components. Some are technical, some are more just how the project is being run. But you get quite a lot of benefits for very little cost, thanks to the Mimblewimble protocol. So you get privacy enabled by default. What I mean by privacy is not, it's not a binary thing. Either you have privacy or you don't. It's a high degree of privacy enabled by default. You have no amounts on chain. You have no addresses on chain. There's no scripts that you can use to identify certain transactions on chain. There's ability to link outputs on chain. There's a chain of outputs by design. This is how the protocol works, and you can use that together with some other data that you might have in a targeted effort to de-anonymize certain users if you wanted. For example, if some user goes to a KYC exchange, you might be able to track that, okay? And then you can ask the exchange, who does these outputs belong to? And then the exchange who has your KYC details will de-anonymize you, right? That's kind of it's not giving you perfect privacy by any means, but by default, the amount of data that is kept on chain is very minimal from that point of view. And in addition to that, usually what happens when you have privacy preserving features is that they end up taking more space, they end up being more complex, and make the entire system more bulky. But with Mimblewimble, you actually get that privacy for free, and scalability is better than with Bitcoin because you don't have to keep the full history to have the same security guarantees as a full node. In Mimblewimble and in Grin, you only need to keep the UTXO set, the unspent transactions. You need to carry those with you, and then some other data like a kernel set and headers and so on. But you don't need to keep the full history of a lifetime of a coin, of a UTXO, in order to get that security guarantee. So it's more efficient, and it keeps less data on chain, and is better privacy preserving. And it's easier to scale, to sync a full node. So you get a lot of benefits essentially for very little cost. Little to no cost.
That's very powerful what you said now. We don't have to keep all transactions, but we can still prove that the system has integrity. So we don't have to the blockchain will scale sort of with a number of users, not necessarily the number of transactions, roughly.
Exactly.
So maybe we can get into some more details how transactions actually work and how can it be so efficient. We get sort of a smaller blockchain, but we actually get more privacy. There are no addresses in Grin, and there are no amounts either. Maybe we don't want to get too technical, but what are some of the pieces that makes this possible?
Sure. So it's essentially the values are hidden through the use of confidential transactions. So you blind the actual values, but through some cryptographic trickery, you can kind of confirm that that you're not creating money out of thin air. A transaction in Grin, unlike other coins, transactions are built interactively between sender and receiver. So when there are no addresses, there's still a way a sender and receiver needs to communicate in a round trip in order to build a valid transaction between themselves, and then that gets put on the chain. So you have a set of inputs that spends to a set of outputs, and then you have a transaction kernel that is created for each transaction. these can be aggregated non-interactively, automatically by the chain in a way to more inputs and outputs. That's and you so if you have 5 transactions, they can all aggregate together and they look like one transaction. And ultimately, then if you have a block, the entire transactions of that block looks like one transaction. They all aggregate together. That doesn't give you a lot of privacy necessarily, because somebody who's monitoring the mempool can see, you know, how these transactions get aggregated to some degree. There's some aggregation that can happen before. It's not you know, it's not bulletproof, but you can definitely you shouldn't expect to get like a lot of privacy from that. But you get a lot of benefits in terms of scalability from that, because then as the blocks get added, the entire blockchain ultimately will look somewhat like one giant transaction, and the inputs that spend to outputs, those that have already been spent, they kind of cancel out in this. There's like this equation that happens,
Right.
and so there's one kind of big equation check, and the inputs that spend to outputs cancel each other out, so you don't need to keep them anymore because it's redundant, and nothing kind of really changes with them, and so you can kind of keep less information going as you spend outputs.
So what you mentioned there about it's not necessarily um, as private as you might think, is that you can monitor, so a full node can monitor transactions before they are aggregated in this in the block. Is that what you meant there?
Correct. This is a scalability benefit. It's not a privacy benefit cut through. Many people think, you know, because you don't keep the history of those transactions, right? So that's great for privacy, but in reality, it's actually not. And there will be people who might run nodes that listen and keep that history, even though you don't need it for the full sync. Somebody can still keep that data, so don't expect it to disappear magically. But the data that you get though is this idea of, all right, this input spent to that output, but that in and of itself is not it's not as transparent as, for example, okay, this is the wallet address that is then spending somewhere else.
Right.
It's kind of forcing these outputs are never used. You create new outputs all the time, and if you create enough outputs between that and yourself, you can kind of distance yourself, and it's hard to link each other. But as I said before, the moment you would go to a KYC exchange and transact with them, there's a trail there. But whether that trail leads all the way back to you and transactions that you did, 2 weeks ago, that's a different question.
Mm.
But in general, like when it comes, privacy is so layered, and there are many areas. It depends on who's looking for you and how they're tracking you and what the motivation is to do that. You can't really be sure. Generally speaking, though, if you're very mindful of your privacy, you shouldn't go to a KYC exchange and give your passport to an exchange, because you're ultimately leaking information about yourself. So
At least you choose to do it if you go to an exchange, I guess.
yeah, exactly. And I think, because there's many people working with privacy, and everybody's taking this very seriously, as they should. And they can sometimes be very critical about Grin and saying, it's not offering good privacy at all. And I can understand where they're coming from. But on the other hand, depends on who the user is as well. If the user is more mindful about making sure that the competing business doesn't know how much they're paying their suppliers, then most likely Grin will give you a good idea, like a good protection from that. It might not protect you against the CIA who's tracking you, or the FBI trying to arrest you for some activity. But then again, maybe the FBI would have other tools to track you and surveil you than just the way you use Grin. So it's a multifaceted, complex question. And I mean, while I would love to see more privacy added to Grin, we're always mindful of making sure that the design that we're doing is minimal, and that what we're adding doesn't come at a big cost.
Yeah, and I think you wrote a really interesting Medium post not that long ago about privacy in Grin as well. So could
Yes,
you
so
check that
there
out?
was a person who wrote an article about breaking Mimblewimbles or Grin's privacy model or something, which where they had essentially done what I described before. They just had a couple of nodes running and listening to transactions in the network,
Yeah.
and were able to see the outputs and inputs linkability. But this is kind of what we disputed there, was that this is not really, this is how the protocol works. And we took, maybe we haven't been very clear about that, and that's like really a lesson learned, and we need to make sure we're clear about that. But it's not really breaking anything, because that's essentially how the protocol works. But I think it wasn't very clear to a lot of people that it was. But it was an interesting it was interesting to see the reactions from that. I think that's like an insight for us as well, that we have to be much clearer in the communication about what Grin can do and what it can't do.
And I think there's an interesting YouTube video about privacy concerns as well from, I think it's a guy from Zcash, Ian Myers. I think
Right.
you have recommended the video as well.
Satoshi has no clothes,
Yeah.
or
And it describes different privacy concerns and the trade-offs. I think that's really
yes.
interesting.
And it's a great talk by Ian Myers. And the attack, there's specifically one attack there that he mentioned, which is kind of what I touched upon as well, is that you can, if an exchange cooperates with somebody who's tracking you, and they send you tracked coins, or they track the process of that, they can de-anonymize you in cooperation with a KYC exchange. And it's very hard to prevent that in the design that Grin has. We're always looking at ideas of how to reduce linkability, but for any kind of decoy-based privacy system like Monero or Grin, this becomes an issue.
All right. One thing you mentioned is that there are no addresses in Grin. So how do we transact with each other? And I think one common misunderstanding is that we have to be online at the same time to communicate. Can you explain how it works?
So there are no addresses on chain, but there are addresses in Grin. And we just did a hard fork a few hours ago, actually, where we introduced Tor hidden services as a way to communicate between wallets. So there's a communication between the sender and receiver. So as a sender, I prepare a transaction. I say, okay, these are the outputs and so on. I send to you, receiver, this information. You process it on your end. You create your new outputs that you'll be able to spend later. And then you send it back to me as a sender to finalize that. And then I can finalize it and broadcast it to the chain. We can do this in a myriad of ways. We can use Tor hidden services, then we don't know much about each other at all. We can use a file exchange. So I can send you a slate file, which is essentially a JSON file, over email or Telegram or WhatsApp or whatever. You can return that back to me, and then you can airdrop it as well. For example, if you're using Apple iOS or whatever, and I can finalize it and broadcast it. So there are addresses. There are, as long as you and I are able to communicate, whichever channel we use for that.
Yeah.
Then we can build a transaction together, and then ultimately that can be broadcasted.
So you can build a transaction with someone somewhere in the world, and that can only be in private, and then you broadcast that finalized transaction to the network.
Correct. And I'm a contributor to a project called Grinbox, which gave you an address for communication. It also handles this async, so it becomes like an inbox for your Grin, so you don't have to be online at the same time. A message is on the server. It's end-to-end encrypted between you and me as a sender and receiver, so that the server cannot really read the message or anything like that. The message is stored there, and then you can come and pick it up and finalize it and put it back there, and I can come and pick it up. So these types of structures are possible, and it allows us not to be online at the same time to build a transaction. But unlike, for example, Bitcoin, which is more of like a fire and forget system, right? You just broadcast a message straight away. You create a transaction
Yep.
and you send it. With Grin, you need to interact with the receiver, and to some degree, this is a limitation. To some degree, this is a benefit because it makes it harder for you to make mistakes. You can't really, you can't, and you can also not spam a user. You cannot dust attack them or anything like that. They have to actively participate to receive funds, which is,
So you
I
probably
kind
have
of
to be less. You probably have to be less worried that you send something to a wrong address. Is that right? Because you have to
yeah,
have the
yeah,
interaction.
because the other person needs to expect it and kind of respond. And it reminds me a lot of, the way cash works in the physical world, that I can't just pay you without you wanting to accept it. I can hand you $100 bill, you have to take it from me, and then maybe you give me change or something. But if you're not there or kind of ready to accept it, I can't just throw it in your face and you take it.
Right.
uh, which is like it kind of, it makes sense to me. And I think today, the way Bitcoin is used and the way Bitcoin transactions are used, it's interactive as well. I don't think there's many people who are just fire forgetting,
Yeah.
sending transactions to each other. You kind of double check with the person. They might not reuse addresses, so they generate new ones.
Exactly. These days, most people are not reusing addresses. There's
So
not
it will always
major
be,
wallet in Bitcoin,
yeah,
except for some exchanges maybe have the same deposit address
sure.
for some time. But that's a good point. And we should mention that Greenbox is implemented in one of the most popular Grin wallets, Wallet 713. Is that right?
Yes, correct. There are other wallets as well. There's Nifla wallet, and there's also a separate Grin implementation in C++, Grin++, that also has its own wallet and node. Um, the Grin kind of on the like the core protocol level tries to be agnostic and not push too much of a certain wallet or certain design. And the idea is to build up a wider ecosystem, because we think that, I mean, just looking at it, we're funded by donations, right? And there's not that many contributors. And if we're to support the wallet and then the GUI and different platforms, and it's a lot of resources, a lot of effort, and I don't really think we have the ability to do that, and I don't think we can fund that by donations. It's better for these projects to come pop up, like mushrooms from the ground, to solve specific problems. And if they think, for example, hey, Grin usability sucks, I'm gonna put together a team and I'm gonna fix it, and that's better for the project itself, for Grin itself, than if there's like a central group of people, a small group of people that take decisions for the entire project.
Yeah. One thing we probably should talk about is mining. I think you mentioned the inflation scheduling Grin. You have 1 Grin per second, basically.
Yes.
That is newly minted to the miners. The block time is 1 minute, so 60 Grins per minute. And you have 2 different mining algorithms. Can you explain the reason for that and how that is evolving over time?
Absolutely. So we use the Cuckoo Cycle family proofs of work, created by John Trump. In a short, very high level description, is that you try to find loops, cycles in graphs. So there's billions of graph connections, and you try to find a 42 cycle loop in those, and that's a valid proof of work solution. There are two kind of branches of algorithms that we use simultaneously since launch. One is targeted to be friendly for GPUs to mine, or kind of ASIC resistant. The other one is targeted for ASICs to be easy for ASICs to mine, ASIC friendly or ASIC tuned. In when Grin launched, 90% of rewards were given to the GPU friendly algorithm, and 10% to the ASIC friendly algorithm. Over time, this is linearly changing, so that after 2 years of existence, 100% of all rewards are going to go to the ASIC ASIC friendly proof of work. So long term, Grin is ASIC friendly. In the short term, when we launched, we wanted to discourage hidden ASICs to be ready, just turned on the network and like dominating the hash power. So we want to ease in the ASICs onto the network over time. So for a few months ago, the rewards surpassed, the ASIC proof of work surpassed the GPU proof of work in terms of rewards. So now a majority of rewards are going to the ASIC friendly proof of work.
I think that makes a ton of sense. I think ASIC resistance is probably futile over a long time. So you can as well be ASIC friendly over the long term. Is that sort of thinking behind it?
Yeah, and the challenge was that, you know, you could be, in order to make it as fair as possible when we launched, and give everybody kind of equal opportunity. If you announce the proof of work in advance, then there will be kind of groups producing ASICs for that, unless they're discouraged from doing that. For example, by only getting 10% of the rewards in any case.
Yeah.
And if keeping it hidden wouldn't have been good for the kind of integrity of the network as well, because then how would anybody know that, you know, the secret group of people, the 5 people who knew about the proof of work, didn't work with some ASIC manufacturers and then reaped all the rewards. So it's a lot of kind of like, it's not a great solution to have 2 proof of work. It's not like the ultimate way to do it. It adds a lot of complexity that we would have loved to avoid. But it was just a compromise that had to be done, I think, in order to be more fair when we launched.
It feels
We
like
also,
fairness is a fundamental value in the project and everything, all the decisions.
yeah, absolutely, I think so. And there was like, it's very hard to be fair, I think, in 2019 when we launched, to launch a cryptocurrency at that point when Bitcoin has already been out for 10 years. There's a lot of attention in the space. We had a lot of attention on a lot of eyes on us when we launched. And at that point, to try to launch something that doesn't give people unfair advantages is very hard. There was a lot of money vested in mining Grin early on. I think it made it very competitive, and it's just a challenge. I mean, Satoshi had a different type of challenge when they launched Bitcoin. They had to bootstrap an entire industry, but at least anybody who wanted could join in, and they had like the equal opportunity there. In 2019, launching Grin, doing it the same way would have been very difficult to make it fair for people, because anybody that it would have been very hard, given that we knew that there were some secret ASICs being developed.
So I want to go back to something we spoke about briefly earlier, and that's how Grin is quite different from many more centralized coins. Grin is more similar to Bitcoin is in that it's decentralized. There's no organization behind Grin. What do you think that means for the ability for Grin to get listed on exchanges, for funding, for development, and so on? Obviously, it's a big appeal for many people, but has it some drawbacks as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's everything's slower. Everything takes longer time. It's hard to get people to contribute. It's hard to be organized as an open source project. But that's kind of also part of the feature. It's almost a feature in a way, because the risk is that it all depends on what your end goal is. What's the end goal? Is it to make a nice ROI on the time you put in and get a good ROI for the money that you put in? Then there's probably a better way to organize it than how we're doing it. If it is to make the currency succeed, in the sense that people are using it, then it's hard to do it a different way. Because if you have a centralized company and a centralized foundation, and they're kind of calling all the shots, and they're getting, you know, millions and millions of dollars worth of assets. Uh, all the decision making will ultimately just kind of flow into these two organizations, and it will be less incentives for people to join and contribute for free. Whereas for Grin to succeed, people have to contribute for free. There's no way we're going to have enough money to pay people to do all the work that is required. And if people don't step up, then the project is doomed. And that's kind of the beauty of it. This means that people have to contribute and engage in the project in order for it to go anywhere. And if it doesn't go anywhere, then I guess people weren't interested enough. So it's kind of do or die in a much fairer way than I think than if you have a mining reward, a funders reward from the mining. You can almost become like a zombie project that, you know, people are just mining, you're getting money, you can pay people, you do the development, but is it going anywhere? Is it going the right direction? How do you know? You know, you just build stuff and you don't really know to what end. Whereas we wanted to eliminate, I mean, the beauty of Grin is that it eliminates all these problems. Sure, there's no funding. We have great donors. They've donated, there's been donors who donated twice 50 BTCs.
Very early mined Bitcoin.
Yeah, early Coinbase rewards from 2010 to Grin, which is fantastic. There must be like some old old school Bitcoin persons who are supportive of what Grin is trying to do, and that's really nice. It's a shot in the arm, and it's like a validation of our approach. Even though that's great, and it's great to have that support, but that's not taking us to like a full. You know, that's never going to be enough. We need a lot of contributions, and excuse me, and part of the challenge I think is for us as a community to figure out how to best spend that money and have like a good governance process. So what we have today, Grin is governed by teams, various teams. There's a wallet team, there's a node team, and there's also a core team, which used to be like the technocratic council. That was created mainly because they needed somebody to manage the multi-sig wallet keys for donations. We were doing a technical audit of the code base before launch, and we were accepting donations for that, and somebody needed to manage the keys. Now we got more donations, and we got these Coinbase rewards and so on donated there as well. Now there's a lot of money in that in those keys, and the core team is managing that along with vision, roadmap, helping other teams be informed and so on. But we're struggling with it as well. It's a big problem and a challenge because it ends up being a centralizing force for the project. There's many some thoughts were like, you know, maybe we should never have accepted any kind of money in a central kind of wallet type of structure. Maybe it would have been better for individual developers to be self-funded. You can argue both ways there. I think some funds are great for Grin to have for things like audits, being able to pay yeast plume, and so on. I think it's good to have it, but you don't want to have like a continuous flow of money coming into the project from mining, because the question is, how do you spend that wisely, and is it being spent wisely by projects who have that much money? We've seen some projects that are contributing, doing fantastic contributions. For example, Zcash is doing fantastic contributions to zero knowledge research. And they've really put zero knowledge protocols on the paper. In the spotlight since they launched. But there's also been a lot of funds raised from that founders reward, and how is it being spent? And now they're kind of coming into this situation where the founders reward is expiring, and they need to do this renewal. And I don't know. There's problems with each of these different approaches, I think.
Yeah, and I think your approach is it probably means that the people working on the project are very passionate about the project.
Yeah, for sure. It's a self-selecting mechanism. Yeah. It was kind of what got me involved in the first place as well. And I think many people, you know, anybody who's looking to make a quick buck, they come to Grin and they quickly run away because they see there's no money to be made here, and that's a good thing, I think. And then you have the people who are interested and passionate; they're more likely to contribute. And if they see something broken, then we really encourage people to fix it themselves, because there's nobody here who owes anybody anything in a way, and that's the beauty of it. Uh, really.
Yeah, fantastic. Maybe looking at the big picture again, what are you most excited about for the coming years, I guess, in Grin, and what people are working on around Grin?
So there's some interesting research that could potentially be incorporated into Grin, stuff like BLS signatures, which might remove the interactivity requirement, and it might also allow us to aggregate more stuff and compress the blockchain size even further. It comes with trade-offs, and
Yeah,
it has different security assumptions, and there's no standard yet, and it's very kind of early days of that research. And the question is how we could add it to Grid. There's also research coming from the Zcash team, Halo, which is also promising, and could have applications for us in Green as well. Um, there's a lot of challenges with us. We just celebrated our 1 year anniversary on mainnet. In the next year, uh, in 1 year from now, our scheduled hard forks are going to run out. After that, we need to have an upgrade strategy of how we're going to be handling upgrades, and what we're going to do with consensus breaking upgrades, if we're even going to have that. There's a lot of kind of challenges in the community now to maintain engagement. I would say we're still in like the crypto winter, right? But Grin also has its own kind of winter, in the sense that there was an insane amount of hype when we launched. 1 year in, there's this hype has kind of gone away, and we're seeing also there's still people are as engaged as they were before, the people who were engaged, but we're also not seeing too many new people come in. And this is something I'm thinking a lot about, because ultimately I think in order for us to survive as a project, we need a lot of new developers coming in all the time in order to grow the ecosystem. And it seems like there's like a bit of a plateau right now from engagement, and I'm thinking about how we can grow that, and make it more interesting for people to join. We'll see what's going to happen in this year. Everybody's kind of celebrating 2020 as like the time where everything's going to change in the market, and that what's that's going to lead to, like more engagement and so on. I don't know. I'm personally quite agnostic about the whole thing. I think it
mm.
seems like, I think it's already kind of priced in, all this stuff, right? I don't really see how the halvening, everybody's like looking forward to that, and Bitcoin like is gonna, change everything, and I'd be very surprised if it does, because everybody's expecting it. And that's
We'll have
usually
to
how
see, I
markets
guess.
work.
We have to see what's happening with that. But it sounds like you will, or Green developers will continue to focus on making the protocol even more minimal and even more privacy preserving.
Absolutely, and the good thing I should add as well, halvening or no halvening, or market changing or not. Fortunately for us, we're funded in such a way now that we probably we have a very low burn rate. We try to keep it low, and hopefully we'll have enough funds for us to be able to be going a couple of years now. We'll see, and depending, maybe we get some good opportunities to spend that money wisely. But we're taking a very conservative approach of how to spend the money, because we don't know if we're going to get any more. So we have to be very cautious about it. But ultimately, Grin will survive regardless, because Grin itself is not really dependent on funding. The beauty of Grin is that it launched, it took about year, 2.5 years to build, and it was done with literally no money. And it came out this kind of novel approach of how to do a cryptocurrency, and Grin will survive no matter what, I'm sure, as long as people find it interesting.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely. I think Green is very unique, and I think that's what makes it so interesting. And I think this was a really interesting conversation with you, Daniel, and thank you so much for your time.
pleasure. It was great
If
to
people
jump
want
on.
to learn more about Green and what you work with as well, where can they find more information?
Sure. So the project's website is grin.mw for Mimblewimble. So grin.mw. And myself, my last name Lehnberg. That's my handle on Twitter, Keybase, Telegram. Anybody who wants to is welcome to reach out to me. There's also the weekly Grin News newsletter, which is linked from the website.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Daniel. And
thank you, Henrik.
talk
Good
to you
pleasure.
soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.